The kings of ancient Egypt were no mere mortals. They were gods incarnate. And the ancient Egyptians cared more for the burial of their kings than any other nation that has existed. 3,500 years ago, they began to build the most revered cemetery on Earth. The Valley of the Kings is the most magnificent burial ground in the world. 62 tombs cut deep into the rock, overflowing with the treasures of ancient Egypt. Pharaohs like Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great were laid to rest here. But before long, this remote valley would become a haven for treasure hunters. Tomb raiders and vandals would break into this secret underground world. They were followed centuries later by European explorers and adventure-seeking treasure hunters like Belzoni. Then, archaeologists like Howard Carter would make breathtaking discoveries and begin to piece together the lives of the pharaohs. The oldest tomb in the valley belonged to the king Thutmose I from the 16th century BC. For the next 500 years, the pharaohs would follow Thutmose I and be buried here in the valley. Ted Brock has been responsible for creating a three-dimensional map of the entire valley and knows every tomb.
Building a tomb was probably in many ways quite similar to quarrying operations that they were carrying out for hundreds or even thousands of years. And so it was a similar process of cutting into the rock, cutting out pieces of rock and removing it.
It was hot, dirty, and dangerous work.
So they'd have groups of people working there, cutting away at the rock face, tunneling in and hauling the debris away. And behind them would be the finishers coming along with the copper and bronze tools, smoothing down the walls, truing them up, and then followed up by the people plastering the walls in preparation for the decoration.
After the walls had been plastered, the decoration began. Outline scribes would draw the hieroglyphics in red ochre. These motifs were copied from pattern books. A vizier would relay the progress to the pharaoh. It was essential for every detail to be correct to ensure the pharaoh's successful union with the afterlife.
The tombs were decorated with these descriptions of the underworld. It was taking this hole in the rock and making it the underworld itself.
Most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings are unfinished, the work cut short by the king's death. But the tomb of Seti I is virtually complete. It was unearthed by the famous treasure hunter Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who in 1817 was lucky enough to chance upon the longest and deepest of all the tombs. Having discovered the secret entrance, Belzoni went on to explore one of the most cavernous tombs ever found.
They built these large chambers in this tomb, and pillars hewn out of the rock. They're not constructed. And beyond, these other chambers as well, with lots of wall space for more decoration.
The pharaoh's body was mummified to preserve him forever. He would lie within many coffins before being lowered into a sarcophagus. This could weigh as much as 10 tons. The lowest chamber of all, several hundred feet down in the rock, was where the pharaoh was laid to rest. Here the pharaoh would rest, sealed in state and surrounded by his finest and most valued possessions. The priest and burial party would seal the chamber. But the new kingdom of ancient Egypt left behind far more wonders than tombs alone. The desire for greatness led some pharaohs to immortalize their grandeur in vast temples. The most splendid of these was built by the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Like many pharaohs, Hatshepsut liked to be remembered as a great leader and warrior. What was unusual was that Hatshepsut was a woman. Built over the hillside from the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Queen Hatshepsut is the most impressive monument of Western Thebes. Hatshepsut's futuristic temple is packed with revolutionary features, a fitting memory to one of Egypt's most innovative pharaohs. Yet unlike Cleopatra or Nefertiti, the story of Hatshepsut's remarkable life is little known.
She actually led armies in battle, and this was something that early historians really didn't want to have to accept.
Hatshepsut was the eldest daughter of Thutmose I, and when her husband Thutmose II died, her young stepson became pharaoh, Thutmose III. Worried that the boy might lose control, Hatshepsut appointed herself as co-regent and later king. Hatshepsut set out to finish what her husband Thutmose II had started, a splendid mortuary temple. Under her control, it would take 15 years to become the greatest architectural achievement of her dynasty. Hatshepsut chose as her architect a man called Senenmut. As the temple was built up, so its visionary design was revealed, with multi-faced columns never seen before. Senenmut copied the ramp design from an adjacent temple complex, but he added other features. On the colonnades, he placed statues to the god Osiris in front of square columns. And at the back of the temple was a unique structure built to withstand the weight of the cliff above it.
This is the innermost sanctuary, and it's constructed in a rather extraordinary way. What they have done is to make a corbelled vault, as we call it, and this is putting one stone on top of another stone and moving closer and closer and closer to the ceiling. And then all those little corners are shaved off on either side. So what you're looking at appears to be a barrel vault.
Hatshepsut died after a long rule of 22 years, a rule when national confidence was boosted by monumental architecture. Her face was erased from her monuments by later kings who thought it wrong that a woman had not only ruled, but had been a hero. Hatshepsut was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Her tomb was aligned with her temple and beyond, with vast obelisks she erected inside the Karnak temple complex. It was here where the kings of ancient Egypt competed to make their mark, creating the largest religious monument on earth. Karnak, 2,000 years of triumph, turmoil, and tragedy. Here, the kings of Egypt destroyed the memory of their forebears to build their own destinies. This was the site where Thutmose I would make his mark of power, where Thutmose III would build on top of the shrines of his own stepmother, where the exquisite carvings of Seti I would be defaced by his own son, Ramesses the Great. This is Karnak, the largest religious complex ever constructed anywhere on Earth. How did it develop into a 250-acre site? When Thebes became the religious capital of Egypt, the Karnak temple became the seat of Amun, the state god. Karnak was soon home to over 600 priests. Its buildings spread west towards the Nile and also south. Obelisks and pylons appeared, followed by shrines and precincts. Then pylons to the east, a vast hall and giant statues. Eventually, the entire site was enclosed by a wall. At the center is a hypostyle hall containing a forest of gigantic columns, some of them 70 feet high, with capitals so big that 50 people could stand on one of them. There are obelisks, one of them the largest standing in Egypt. There are vast statues of kings, their egos frozen in stone. And there are monumental gateways and vast entrances, pylons. They are the largest in Egypt and decorated like giant billboards with incredible stone carvings. Standing up to 100 feet high, it's a marvel that they were built without cranes of any kind. Building to an enormous scale never daunted the kings of ancient Egypt. Each king set out to surpass the last. Karnak was about rivalry and competition, and obelisks were a measure of this. Obelisks marked the first rays of the day's sunlight, and Hatshepsut made sure hers outshone her father's, Thutmose I. At 96 feet high, Hatshepsut's is the tallest surviving obelisk in Egypt. Weighing 323 tons, it was carved from one single piece of granite 400 miles away at Aswan. Here lay the highly prized granite quarries. After the 400-mile river journey to Karnak, the chances of a mistake increased dramatically. Too much pressure in the middle, and the giant slab would snap under its own weight. But this was just the easy part. On arrival at Karnak, the giant granite block was hauled up a mound, base first. With men to maneuver and sand to do the real work, the giant stone was skillfully lowered into place. With time and enough labor, anything was possible. But then, building techniques were about to change when along came scaffolding. One king, by the name of Akhenaten, was in such a hurry to realize his ambitions, he invented new methods of construction. Under his command, stone blocks were cut to a standard size. Known as a talatat, they measured about 50 centimeters long and could be easily handled by one man.
It meant the whole building process was freed up. An unskilled workman could easily carry the blocks right to the top of a building structure, and the whole process was much faster and cheaper.
But it didn't last. Small blocks were quick to build up, but even quicker to pull down. And the next pharaohs, Tutankhamun and Horemheb, both plundered Akhenaten's buildings, the talatat blocks becoming rubble infill for their giant pylons. So the pharaohs returned to building big. And there is one structure at Karnak that not even a giant could pull down. The hypostyle hall is the largest single religious building ever constructed. The vast hall was begun by the pharaoh Horemheb, continued under Seti I, and completed by his son Ramesses II in around 1220 BC. It's a forest of columns 70 feet high. How was it put together?
Ancient Egyptian temples are built using huge columns like this one and architraves that span between them. This was one of their biggest problems because the architrave had to support not only its own weight, but the weight of the great stone roof above.
Undaunted, the ancient Egyptians simply carried the weight with enormous columns.
Columns became so big that their bases were built out of two stones like these, brought together with a perfect joint down the middle. They would be left rough and the whole column built on top of it.
Earth was banked up around them as they grew to 70 feet high. Bridging the gap between each capital was a vast architrave, a single block of sandstone spanning 30 feet. These could weigh up to 80 tons and had to be hauled up onto the site. These architraves were placed onto the roughly built columns. Now the stonemasons worked their way down, creating beautiful carved columns. And if a mistake was made, plaster was used to cover the cracks. Later, these relief carvings were exquisitely painted. As they worked their way down, slowly the earth mound was dug away. Ramesses II completed the hall using deep sunken outlines and buckets of plaster, changing the decorations to his own image and rewriting history. And he set out to cover Egypt in monuments to glorify his name. The most famous is his temple at Abu Simbel. Ramesses' power extended as far south as the deserts of Nubia, where he built 7 temples. The most impressive is at Abu Simbel. It was built to advertise Ramesses' ultimate power, and it would become the finest rock-cut temple in the world. Gangs of masons set to work on the facade to transform a cliff face into 2 pairs of enormous statues of the pharaoh. Carved out of the living rock, they were to be 69 feet high. Why did Ramesses choose this remote desert as the site for his temple? Nubia was important for mining and for traders coming from the south. Lying far from Thebes, the area was free from the power of the priesthood at Karnak. And so here, Ramesses could pay less attention to the established gods and could concentrate on promoting his own image. Inside, Ramesses had a hyper-style hall cut from the natural rock. The columns he had faced with giant standing statues of himself. His triumphs and achievements decorate the walls. His enemies cower before him. Syrians plead for mercy. A Libyan soldier is trampled underfoot. In the innermost sanctuary, Ramesses depicts himself beside the gods, in the middle, with Amun-Re. As twice every year the rising sun would penetrate this part of the temple and illuminate his image. The vast exterior statues were designed to be seen from miles away for all eternity. But in the 1960s, when the Aswan Dam was built, the temple was threatened by the rising waters of Lake Nasser. 51 nations from across the world contributed through UNESCO to save the monument. Piece by piece, the entire cliff face and temple were cut into 30-ton blocks and reassembled 200 feet up at the top of the cliff, like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Not even the waters of Lake Nasser could rise above the king who constructed his own immortality in stone. Egypt had long had its own icons and mythologies. The most mysterious of all is the largest freestanding stone sculpture in the world. No one is certain who it represents or even who built it. Half human, half animal, the Sphinx has long been considered the strangest icon on Earth. At 60 meters long and 20 high, it guards the Giza Plateau beside Egypt's 2 largest pyramids. For centuries, the Sphinx has been seen as the key to life. Pharaohs have worshipped at its feet. Conquerors have knelt down before it. The Sphinx has been subjected to every test, but remains an enigma. In ancient Egyptian art, the idea of fusing animal with human was nothing new. But this was the first time a human head was sculpted onto a lion's body. And in ancient Egypt, there was only one person who could be portrayed in such a way, the pharaoh himself. But as the stonemasons began carving lower down, they ran into a soft layer of rock and hit a fissure. This poor stone may have forced the builders to extend the body. They then had to clad the bad area in a limestone casing. But it wasn't long after the Sphinx was finally completed that the entire statue would become buried beneath the sand for over 1,000 years. Thutmose IV rediscovered it and installed a 15-ton granite stela, or inscription, between its paws. But soon the desert sands were to consume the monument again before tomb builders came to the plateau. And because the body was hidden, tomb builders and treasure hunters have dug unknowingly into the Sphinx. The Sphinx may represent Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, which stands at its side. It's the oldest wonder of the world and has been standing for 4,500 years. It's the greatest tomb ever constructed and remains the largest stone building on Earth. It was built for the pharaoh Khufu in 2560 BC, and from that time to this, the Great Pyramid has remained an icon of world architecture. The pharaoh Khufu had been brought up with pyramids. His father had been a builder on a grand scale. And from the start, Khufu set out to construct a pyramid that was perfect. Firstly, the pyramid was aligned with the compass. The points where the North Star rose and set were divided to define true north. Then the base was leveled. Khufu's pyramid covers 13 acres and is level to within just 1 inch.
They did this using a rectangular grid of channels in the rock, which they could fill with water. And any protrusion sticking up above the water could be shaved off.
Once the base was marked out and the ground level, building could begin.
This is where they cut the stones to build the pyramid. To move them, they dragged them from here up a great straight main ramp up to the pyramid itself.
For the lower courses, the blocks weighed 5 tons or more. But as the pyramid grew, the weight of the stones reduced. In total, the workers hauled a staggering 2,300,000 stone blocks. For the first time in pyramid building, the blocks did not slope inwards, but were laid in horizontal courses. One was fitted into place every 3 minutes. But despite this pace, Khufu's pyramid would take 22 years to construct. Inside, the pyramid becomes a puzzle. From the entrance, a passage descends to the subterranean chamber carved out of the bedrock. It leads nowhere and leaves us with a mystery. Above, the Queen's chamber is a sealed room for a statue of Khufu, representing his Ka, or spiritual force. From here, there's a spectacular high-ceilinged passage.
The grand gallery leading up to the king's burial chamber was built using a technique called corbelling. This is a simple form of arch that the Egyptians excelled at. Each stone block is progressively stepped in until you reach the top, and it has the advantage both of reducing the span that they have to bridge and of giving the room a great feeling of grandeur.
Above this, high up in the pyramid, is the king's chamber, designed to be Khufu's final resting place.
It's incredible, it's incredible. It's entirely walled in granite, and these roof slabs were the biggest span ever attempted at that time, 4,500 years ago. The Egyptians were so worried about the weight of the slab and the fact it might collapse under its own self-weight that they built a series of voids or chambers above to try and hold the weight of the pyramid off this roof right here. And then right at the top, 2 great stones lean against each other like a V. and that takes the force, the weight of the pyramid, right down and guides it down these beautiful sidewalls. It's the most fantastic space I've ever been in.
Inside the stress-relieving chambers remain the graffiti of the workmen. One of them mentions the name Khufu, the only record of the pharaoh for whom this pyramid was built. There are other curious features, like two tiny shafts that run from this chamber towards the outer face of the pyramid. These are believed to have released the pharaoh's ka, or spirit, to the heavens.
On their way out, once Khufu was in his sarcophagus, the priests and the engineers sealed the tomb by dropping 3 huge granite slabs down these great slots here, sealing it off forever.
Then the entrance at the other end of the Grand Gallery was also sealed. To get out, the engineers now had to climb down a near-vertical escape shaft, make their way back up the descending passage, past the blocking stones, and out through the entrance. Then the passages were blocked and the entrance sealed with a flapstone, indistinguishable from the pyramid casing. These wonders all stood within the world's first empire and have inspired every civilization to follow them. The wonders of ancient Egypt will remain world landmarks for all eternity.